Hey everyone! Today we're going to go through a quick introduction of corporate structure and look at the different types of business ownerships that exist, as well as some of the key personnel involved within these kinds of organisations. So first up, there's some key terminology that you really need to familiarise yourselves with. It's really important that you understand the distinction between ownership and control. Let's look at an example where we can explain this with. So let's say I bought 200 Woolworths shares on the Australian Stock Exchange. Now when you purchase shares, you are purchasing ownership of that company, whether it's big or small. But when we look at control of the company, I wouldn't have any control over how the business actually operates. And while I do have certain entitlements being an owner, such as receiving dividends, which will be redistributed to shareholders, I don't actually have a say in how the business conducts its operations, and I can't influence that. Now, if we wanted an example of someone who controls the company, then a good example would be the CEO. The CEO has a direct say in how the business conducts its operations on a day-to-day basis. And often is the case, the CEO can have part ownership as well as having control, so they can fit into both of these categories. Let's move on and have a look at the distinction between these two terms here, personal liability and limited liability. So if we go back to our Woolworths example, say I purchased $6,000 worth of shares, I got 200 shares for $6,000, I would then have limited liability, meaning that the only amount that I would lose is the $6,000 I invested in Woolworths. I wouldn't have to forego my own money or my assets outside of that in order to pay for it. I would only lose that $6,000 that I had invested. On the other hand, let's say there's a small business owner who runs their own cafe. They would have personal liability, and if they were to go bankrupt, they may need to sell their car or their house if they didn't have the funds readily available in order to meet these financial commitments and obligations. Now let's have a look at the types of businesses that you can set up, and the first one being a sole trade. Let's look at Anna, who is a small business owner and runs her own hair salon. So if we look at some of the characteristics of a sole trader and look at Anna's example, Anna owns and controls the entire business. She is also personally liable. So she has liability if the salon goes bankrupt. She'd have to pay for those debts with her own money and her own assets. Not trying to be a negative Nancy, but if she were to pass away, more often than not the business would cease to exist. It would close down. Lastly, Anna is taxed at a personal level. Now you can either be taxed on a personal level or a business level, but with sole traders they're always taxed on a personal tax level. So one of the things I'd like for you guys to prepare and ready to be discussed in class next time is think about whether being taxed on a personal level is an advantage or a disadvantage for Anna in this scenario. Now let's move on to partnerships. So let's say there's two brilliant entrepreneurial students who have an idea for the next big app, something like Snapchat or Facebook. They wouldn't launch their company as a sole trade because there are obviously two of them, and they most likely would both want to have 50% of the company. Now there are two types of partners. There are both general partners and limited partners. So let's have a look at the distinctions between these two. The characteristics that describe a general partner, firstly, is ownership of the company, control of the company, and personal liability over the company. On the other hand, if we look at limited partners, whilst they also do have ownership, the differences occur in the level of control and liability. So for limited partners, they have no control and they also have limited liability. So if we were to go back to our Woolworths example, would that be an example of a general partner or a limited partner? If you guessed right, that would be a limited partner. You own the company, but you have no control and you have limited liability. But what about our two brilliant entrepreneurial students? Well, for them, they would be general partners because they have ownership of the company, control of the company, and if the company does go bankrupt, they are personally liable and would have to pay for these debts with their own assets. So moving on, let's look at the corporate structure of corporations. Now, corporations are a bit more democratic, and there are a lot more levels of management involved. So first up, we're going to look at the board of directors. Now, the board of directors sit right at the top of the organisation. Their role is to set and monitor the high level of strategy of the company. But another big part of their role is that they monitor the performance of the CEO. So they can hire and fire the CEO. So looking at the CEO, let's look at Mark Zuckerberg, who's the CEO of Facebook. Mark's role is to carry out the strategy set out by the board of directors and to conduct business operations on a day-to-day basis. But he does need to ensure that he performs, otherwise he may get fired by the board of directors. If he's not performing well, they can hire a new CEO. Right under Mark would be the Chief Financial Officer. They are solely responsible for the investment decisions of the firm and the finance decisions of the firm. The one big thing in common with all these people is that they want to make the firm as valuable as possible. All these people here want to ensure that Facebook is the biggest success as possible.